Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mohammed Abdul-Kader. I'm the Executive Director of the Stevens Initiative, and I hope everyone is having a great afternoon. We're very thankful that you all could join us this afternoon for this webinar entitled Setting Up Virtual Exchange Evaluation with our colleagues from RTI. We've got a really exciting webinar lined up for you on the topic of evaluation. We felt like this was a really important one to do and put out there for practitioners and educators and everyone in the field to use. With us today are Christina Stearns and Jen Laird from RTI. They're the experts that are going to be guiding us through this discussion. Just a quick housekeeping note, if you would, keep your questions until the Q&A period, which will be a little bit later in the webinar. And also another point of housekeeping, that this will be recorded and later posted on our Stevens Initiative YouTube channel. And then finally, make sure to follow us on social media. We have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter page, and then you can also go to our website, www.stevensinitiative.org, and sign up for our listserv so you can stay up to speed on all of the happenings. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Jen and Christina to get us started. Jen, Christina, take it away.
Great. Hi. We wanted to be able to say hello first before we switch over to our PowerPoint, and we're really excited to be sharing this information with you today.
Okay, hello everybody. This is Christina. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very happy to be here today to talk about evaluating virtual exchange programs. We're going to start today by telling you a little bit about our organization, which is RTI International, and briefly describe the approach and methods we've been using as the external evaluator of the Stevens Initiative. Then we're going to talk a little bit more generally about considerations for practitioners and evaluators in designing and implementing an evaluation of virtual exchange programs. And we're reserving plenty of questions for time at the end of the presentation. So RTI, which is our organization, is a nonprofit multidisciplinary research organization. We have expertise in social and laboratory sciences, engineering, and international development. We have 11 U.S. offices. We're headquartered in North Carolina, and 11 international offices as well. With almost 5,000 employees, our diverse work is united by a common mission to improve the human condition by turning knowledge into practice. The research team for the Stevens Initiative evaluation includes RTI staff from the Center for the Study of Evaluation and Educational Equity and from the International Development Group. Our team is based in both the DC and the Berkeley area in California. I am a senior research associate here, and Jen Laird is our project director. Also on our team is David Silver, who's the PI on the project, as well as Jennifer Jeffries and Jenny Spratt. So just as a bit of background, we came on board as the external evaluator for the Stevens Initiative in June of 2016. Our evaluation to date has mostly focused on the first cohort of 10 Stevens Initiative awardees who are implementing virtual exchange programs. Our evaluation is also studying the work of the Stevens Initiative as a whole, and particularly its work to support and expand the field of virtual exchange programs. I want to start off by talking a little bit about the reasons you might evaluate a program like the Stevens Initiative and why you might want to evaluate virtual exchange programs more generally. So Jen is going to talk about some of the reasons for evaluating.
So one of the benefits of designing an evaluation is that it can help you and clarify your strategy. So one example is it can help you think critically about the specific outcomes you expect your intervention to affect. Throughout the Stevens Initiative, we've worked with partners at the Aspen Institute and the funders and awardees to help them hone in on the specific global competencies that the initiative hopes to impact. And by global competencies, we're talking about skills, knowledge, and dispositions. And as I'll explain a little bit longer, we've looked at how other Researchers and practitioners have defined and measured global competencies, and there's a wide variety of terms and theories and measurements used. So really honing in on exactly which the Stevens Initiative is focused on has been critical for our first set of work, and something that we encourage you to think about with your own evaluations.
A second reason you might want to evaluate virtual exchange programs is to understand and improve implementation. So conducting an evaluation of the Stevens Initiative has really allowed the initiative and its partners to take stock of common challenges that awardees have faced as they've implemented their programs, as well as creative ways that they might deal with those challenges. And this helps support the field by allowing practitioners to learn from each other's experiences. A third reason you might want to evaluate is to monitor outcomes and impact. So obviously one of the main benefits of evaluation is it allows you to measure if the programs are affecting the outcomes they're seeking to affect and to what degree. For example, you want to know, are participants gaining the skills and knowledge that you expected them to gain from your program? And then the final reason is to build an evidence base. So evaluation provides practitioners with data that can be shared with potential funders or partners about the concrete benefits of virtual exchange programs. So this can help, in turn, spur investment in the field. And knowledge about what works can also help inform future program design. So this just shows some general points about how we're approaching the evaluation. So we're approaching this as a developmental evaluation. So while traditional evaluations often provide just summative results to external funders to validate programs and practices, developmental evaluation has the benefit of allowing for real-time feedback, supporting ongoing adaptation and improvement in programs. We selected this approach because the Stevens Initiative is a relatively new initiative, and it involves 10 awardees with very diverse programs, including some programs that are newly developed and are being implemented for the first time. So we wanted to be able to be flexible and respond to the real-time needs of evaluation stakeholders, regardless of what was originally in our scope of work. We've been committed throughout the evaluation to engaging critical stakeholders, so we want to ensure that awardees and other partners can understand and use the data being collected and analyzed, and also we want to leverage local knowledge and experience to inform our research. One way we're doing this is by having an evaluation working group, and this includes representatives from each of the 10 Stevens Initiative awardees, Stevens Initiative staff, and also the 2 largest funders of the project. RTI was selected to conduct the Stevens Initiative evaluation after the awardees had been selected, and after, in many cases, they had already proposed their evaluation activities, and in some cases even started their evaluation activities. So we wanted to be sure that we were leveraging the awardees' work to the greatest extent possible and not requiring duplicative effort. And then, as with all of our projects, we're committed to conducting culturally competent evaluations to make sure we're thoughtful about the cultural backgrounds of the individuals involved in the programs that we're studying, and aligning our data collection methods and vocabulary to be sensitive to those backgrounds. And then finally, the ultimate goal of the evaluation is to measure the outcome and the impact of awardee virtual exchange programs, as well as the impact of the Stevens Initiative as a whole on the field of virtual exchange. So with this first round of awardees, much of our evaluation has been descriptive. So for example, we're primarily looking at data on self-report data from participants and educators on the knowledge and skills that they've gained from participating in these virtual exchange programs. And this can provide some preliminary evidence about the effectiveness of virtual exchange programs, but it can't definitively establish that programs are causing certain outcomes. But as the initiative matures, we're really striving to increase the rigor of our evaluation. And this can take many forms. So for example, we're currently working with the initiative and its partners to identify some more rigorous measurement tools, things like assessments of specific participant outcomes, specifically in the area of global competencies. So for example, things like cross-cultural communication and collaboration. We in the initiative are also interested in supporting awardees to implement more rigorous evaluation designs. So collecting data from comparison groups of non-participants, for example, or following up with participants after the program has been concluded to study the lasting impact of the program. And so increasing the rigor of our evaluation as the initiative matures will allow us to say more about the outcomes of these programs. So this slide just shows some of the different data collection methods that we're using in the evaluation. So the first is surveys of participants, educators, and these are mostly being conducted by the program separately, but they're using some common survey items that we all developed as a group in the evaluation working group. RTI also conducted site visits to do focus groups with participants and also to interview educators, facilitators, and program management. We conducted these in both the US and in Morocco, where a number of awardees have programs. RTI is also conducting key informant interviews beyond program participants, so funders, other stakeholders in the field, to understand the role of the Stevens Initiative, understand the role that the Stevens Initiative is playing in the broader field of virtual exchange more generally. We're also tracking participant demographic data, and this is really with an eye toward looking at to what extent are these programs reaching groups who may be underrepresented and might traditionally not have access to international exchanges. And then finally, awardees are collecting data in a number of other ways. So for instance, having participants write written reflections or analyzing and coding the content of written exchanges between participants on the technological platform that they're using. And we're looking at all that data as well in our evaluation.
Great, thank you. Okay, so with that background of the Stevens Initiative and what we've been doing, we wanted to step back a little bit and share some information about fundamentals of evaluation design for those of you who are thinking of evaluating your programs. These fundamentals and sort of recommendations come both from our general experience as evaluators as well as some specific experiences we've had with this first round of awardees and evaluating the initiatives, and some things we want to sort of highlight and flag for particular consideration when you're evaluating virtual exchanges. So the first, we encourage you to start early. Evaluation is something you should be thinking about as you're designing your program. They often involve collecting data as participants are entering the program, and developing data collection tools can take time. So if you wait just before the program starts or as the program is ending, that'll put severe limits on the information you can collect and therefore the value of the information that you are able to share from the evaluation. The second is articulate a vision of success. As Christina mentioned, evaluations can help you clarify your strategy, and you can do that by articulating your vision of success. Ask yourselves what success will look like in this program. What specific outcomes do you seek to achieve, and what's going to enable you to achieve those? There are tools you can consider using in articulating your vision of success. They are called theory of changes or logic models, and it's typically a table or graphic one-page format where you specify things such as short-term and long-term outcomes and activities and resources you'll implement and leverage in order to achieve the success as you've defined it. It's very important to decide what to measure, and this is a more involved and complicated step than you might imagine if you haven't done an evaluation before. You want to be really realistic about what you think the outcomes can be, especially in the time frame of your program. So for example, you might intend for your program to promote peace between the US and MENA countries, or to increase employability rates for young adults. Those are great intended outcomes, but they're very long-term outcomes, and we advise you to focus on short or medium-term outcomes that could be early potential predictors of these very important long-term outcomes. So for example, in terms of peace, it might be more reasonable in a semester-long program to hope that cross-cultural empathy increases, or that in terms of employability, perhaps that your participants gain skills on clear presentations of projects. Those would be more realistic outcomes to measure. Another example is if your program intends to improve digital literacy, think about what specific digital literacy skills you expect to improve, especially in a relatively short time frame. So perhaps it's conducting research on the internet or creating a digital movie. be specific and realistic in deciding what to measure. Okay, be mindful of the impact of evaluation on the youth educators and program facilitators and minimize burden to the greatest extent possible. For example, if you use a survey, a good rule of thumb is that it shouldn't be longer than 20 minutes. An hour-long survey, particularly if it has to be administered at the beginning of an end of a program, would just be too much in our professional opinion. First, respondents will have trouble focusing on such a long survey. So the quality of your data will probably not be great, as some respondents skip questions and others stop concentrating. Second, 2 hours of survey time takes away 2 hours of program time, and for some virtual exchanges, that's a substantial amount of their program. In terms of setting expectations, we want to make 2 points. First, communicate with your implementation partners about what will be needed for the evaluation and why. So, for example, if you're relying on classroom teachers to administer surveys, let them know with ample time that this is going to need to happen, and really explain to them why the evaluation is important to your program. And tell them how you're going to support them administering the surveys. If they're going to be written surveys, are you going to print and mail them to you? If they're online surveys, are you going to provide a short tutorial or training for them so that they're very comfortable getting the students onto the online survey? Another aspect of setting expectations is communicating with your key stakeholders, especially your funders, what questions your evaluation will be able to answer and which they won't. One way you can do this is by sharing your logic model and theory of change, which should have very clearly stated outcomes. And you indicate which outcomes you'll be measuring in this evaluation and which perhaps you won't, because you're not able to follow them, for example, as long as you would like. And so that's something you would tackle perhaps under another evaluation. You want to be really clear about whether you have a comparison group or not, and whether you're going to be able to make stronger statements about the impacts of your program. You also want to set expectations. Are you really focused on describing outcomes, or are you also going to provide information, or include in your research, looking at which practices appear to be more effective within your virtual exchange program? Okay, Christina mentioned sort of level of rigor, and I want to return back to this because it's very key. So what you see here are 3 tiers of evidence, and this is a framework that's used in many U.S. federal research grant programs and is generally accepted in research fields, and we've seen foundations use the same sort of tiers of evidence, so we want to walk through them. The first is preliminary or emerging or promising evidence, and this is when you have a model that perhaps you have a very reasonable hypothesis, perhaps it's supported by literature, you have a clearly articulated theory of change, and you have some initial correlational research findings. So that would be something like a pre and post test, and you say when our participants were in this program, we observed an increase in cross-cultural communication skills. So that would be the preliminary level of evidence. The next step is moderate, and here the key is having an evaluation design that incorporates a counterfactual, and that is comparison between what actually happened and what would have happened in the absence of the intervention or the program. So impact evaluation seeks to answer the cause and effect. In other words, they look for changes and outcomes that can be directly attributable to a program. For example, a program might find that their students reported an increase in interest in global events. But we can't be sure that that increase in global events is attributed to the program unless we have information from another group of students who weren't in the program. Because perhaps during the program period, a major global event happened, a devastating earthquake, a devastating set of fires that made international news, or a war started. Those things could cause students' interest to increase in global events. So by having a group of students who are in the program and a similar group of students who are not, when we see changes among the students who are in the program and we don't see it in the comparison group, we can much more confidently talk about it as program sort of support the causal conclusions that the program brought about these changes. Okay. So the moderate is if you have one of those studies or maybe a whole bunch of correlational studies that you see across different contexts. Then to get to the highest level of evidence, strong is where you have multiple studies that can support causal conclusions, so multiple studies where there is a good comparison group. And two terms you may hear, I won't define them intensely, but randomized control trials, RCT, or quasi-experimental design studies. Those are two of the most common evaluation designs that support causal conclusions. So for strong, you need multiple of those, and you need to see them across many different contexts. So for the Stevens Initiative, we are really, we think, poised to support the initiative and the awardees in moving into the moderate and strong levels. I'd say we're in the early moderate maybe right now because there's been a number of correlational studies, but we'd like to strengthen the level of evidence. Okay. Now we're going to talk again about what to measure and want to make really clear that there's a very important distinction between outputs and outcomes. So outputs, which also can be called activities, services, or approaches, versus outcomes, which are also called results, impacts, or accomplishments. Outputs details what your organization does, whereas outcomes defines the changes that have taken place because of your outcomes work. So let's say that people who have participated in your program started to get engaged in local civic organizations to address environmental issues that they became more aware of through your virtual exchange. That's an outcome. Whereas stating that you had 50 participants in your program and they completed it, that's an output. Another example on the educator level, if you report that you've provided professional development to 20 teachers, that's an output. But if you can demonstrate that those teachers went on to incorporate virtual exchanges into more classes because of the professional development they received, let's say they were trying one and then they got more professional development and they felt more comfortable then implementing it into 5 of their classes, that's an outcome. All right, so what outcomes are important to measure? You'll want to consider whether you are going to measure participant outcomes, educator outcomes, and or institutional outcomes. And for participant outcomes within the Stevens Initiative and the virtual exchange field, there are kind of at least 3 buckets you might consider, and the Stevens Initiative absolutely considers all 3 of them. One is global competencies, and as I mentioned, we've done a scan of the research and practice literature on how folks define global competencies and how they measure them, and there are lots of different terms used and lots of different ways folks are attempting to measure these. So one thing we're doing as an initiative is trying to get very clear and specific about what we think the key global competencies are, and those are cross-cultural communication, empathy. There's about 6 or 7 we're currently prioritizing, and being very clear about how we're going to measure them. Most programs have some substantive components, so whether it's a STEM education program or a public health virtual exchange course or a civics leaders virtual exchange program, there's something in addition to just general global competencies that you're aiming to improve for students' learning. So you want to think about how to measure that. And if you're, let's say it's a science course in high school or a STEM course in high school, perhaps there's already an end of course exam that you can use as a way to measure learning. Again, you'll want to think about students would have been in this course without the virtual exchange component, so perhaps You're curious to see whether the end of course exam students do better if they had a virtual exchange component compared to another class you're teaching that didn't have it. When doing that, you want to think about whether that end of course exam is sensitive in the ways of picking up how the learning might be different for the virtual exchange program. So it may be that students learned in both contexts, but what they learned in the virtual exchange was sort of a deeper understanding of cross-national implications. And if your end of course test doesn't include something like that, you're not going to pick up a difference. So you need to think about things like that. Behavior change might be different plans for careers. It could be getting engaged in different organizations after the exchange. So you want to think about behavior change, and is it something that would be observed much after the program, and if so, do you have plans for measuring that? Educator outcomes could be things related to comfort in incorporating virtual exchanges. That's just an example. Institutional outcomes could be spreading of more virtual exchange embedded courses, partnerships with others to conduct more virtual exchanges. Okay, so once you've decided what you're going to measure, you need to think about how to measure. And Christina mentioned some of the things, some of the methods we've used, and I'll mention a few others and talk about sort of the pros and cons, some just as examples. So surveys, one pro of surveys is that they can be, they're typically quantitative and they can be aggregated. A challenge of them is that they're based on self-report. So you need to think about the limits of that. Performance assessments, again, that's something like an end of course test. And with that, they can be good for substantive knowledge gains, but for something like global competencies, those are more challenging, we think, to assess with a performance assessment as opposed to something like science games. Participant projects and portfolios, and using rubrics to assess those and see if the gains you expected to occur, perhaps a deeper understanding of a global issue. That can be a really rich way to evaluate your program. A challenge with that is that it's hard to scale that type of evaluation method. So it's not something we're looking at in the Stevens Initiative because it's hard to do on a large scale, including because each program is producing different types of products and projects. Focus groups and interviews with participants, getting qualitative data is really important. There are things you can just not, nuances and richness you cannot get from surveys. Some challenges with those is ideally independent evaluator or researcher leads this. There it can be some problems if a practitioner who's working with the students already tries to do a focus group, the students and the educators might not feel that they can be as candid, and there can be logistic challenges with having an independent person facilitate and organize the focus groups and interviews. Participant reflections is something you can also get really deep reactions that can also be kind of difficult to scale in terms of coding and aggregating results from a large range of reflections. Observations we found to be very valuable. Of course, a challenge with that is that it's costly often for researchers to travel to each program, and you want to make sure you have a good observation tool where, as a researcher, you know exactly what you're trying to look and code for. Discourse analysis. This is something that a few of the programs tried this year, and we're really excited to see and anxious to see what comes out of this. So this is analyzing the text and in some cases the conversations that occurred over the course of the programs and looking for how those conversations evolved. Did they seem to get deeper? Did they, both in the substantive knowledge as well as getting to know each other and appreciating and learning about each other's cultural differences. This also is quite time-consuming. There are some programs that will do sort of automated semantics analysis, and that can tell you some things. But to do deeper coding is very labor-intensive. And I think there's some excitement that because these programs are virtual, many of them folks are, communicating via text and emails and posting. So there's a natural recording of the conversations. So that presents some possibilities. Okay, so how to measure. Again, you want to make sure that you are identifying measures that are really targeted to the outcomes you intend to measure. So you need to be very clear about what those outcomes are, and then check to make sure that the survey items you think you wanted to use, do they actually really get at what you're hoping to improve. You want the measurement to be valid and reliable. So valid means, does the measure measure what's intended to measure? So there are different types of validity, which I won't describe, but I'll list them just so you know that there are different things to consider: face validity, content validity, construct validity. Reliability is, does it reliably measure the construct? So for example, assuming conditions haven't changed and you give someone a survey of, say, optimism, sort of, are they somebody who views the world as a glass half empty or a glass half full? If we think that's a pretty stable characteristic and things shouldn't change over a few days, if you give this optimism survey on Monday and again on Friday, are the scores pretty similar? That's called test-retest reliability. We encourage you to consider whether there are existing scales and measures of the outcomes you care about, and when you do that, you'll see that there are specific sort of statistics around validity and reliability. Is your measure sufficiently sensitive? So virtual exchange programs, some of them are relatively short in time or spread over a semester or a year, but maybe 2 hours a week. And we wanted to lift this up. Particularly, we reviewed some surveys that have been used in-person exchanges, often long exchanges, a semester abroad type experience. And when we looked at those, the measures to us looked like these are changes you might expect to see in a very long-term immersive experience, and we think the virtual exchange experience, these surveys are not sufficiently sensitive to pick up the types of changes we would expect to see in a virtual setting. You want them to be age appropriate. The Stevens Initiative has programs from a few middle school grades, but really high school through post-secondary and young adults. And there are some items that might be appropriate for high school students, but not so much for post-secondary students, including because they probably started at a different place. So for example, digital literacy among high school students, particularly in the MENA region, we saw when we were in Morocco that for many of them, this was the first time they were using the internet to do research, whereas at a post-secondary institution, you wouldn't expect that they would be starting at that level. So you need to think about the age of your folks. It needs to be appropriate across cultures. So you want to think not only about language and translation, but also about whether the nuances of a straight translation really make sense in a given culture. And there's translation. Okay. Okay, so some common logistical considerations. First, we'll start with survey response rates. In large national surveys, which RTI does quite a bit. There is an absolute expectation that we achieve at least an 85 response rate, and if not, it's considered not a valid survey. So we're suggesting high targets like that for Stevens Initiative programs, and some ways that can help you achieve a high response rate is consider leveraging the technology of the platform that you're using for the virtual exchange. So let's say you want youth to complete a pre-survey within the first day of the program, so you can have the survey embedded into the program and they can't actually get to the platform without completing the survey. That's one way to work towards achieving a really high response rate. If you do that, you want to be very careful to make it clear to the participants that the answers that the survey is anonymous, and you really want their candid answers, because you don't want them to think that how they're answering is going to impact whether or not they actually get accepted into the program. So that's something to think about. Another way to improve survey response rate is to, again, have the educators really understand and bought into the purpose of the evaluation, so they know why it's really critical that they help administer these surveys. You might offer response incentives especially for comparison participants. You might provide them with an incentive to fill out the survey, like a $10 gift card. Okay, for participant unique IDs, this is really critical and something that we noticed challenges with for some of the first awardees. So when you're doing pre and post surveys, you need to be able to match the individuals and make sure that the sample is identical. So you want to have participant IDs and exclude in your analysis folks who didn't complete both a pre and post survey. And why is that important? Because we saw some examples where there were, a lot of students participating in the pre-survey and many fewer in the post survey, and they didn't have we couldn't link the data. So the average response on the pre couldn't be compared to the average response on the post because they were different groups of students. It's very possible that the folks who didn't answer the post survey were different than those who did. They might have been ones who were not happy with the program and would have given more negative feedback had they actually done the post. So participant ID so that you can match pre and post is critical. You want to think about, if you're doing an online survey, do they have access to technology? If they may not have it at home, so you want to make sure you create time in the program and provide the technology for them to do the surveys. And allow for critical feedback. We learned, for example, when we were in Morocco in a focus group, that some of the folks misunderstood the purpose of the survey, and again, they thought the pre-survey was going to be used to screen them in and out of the program. So they felt uncomfortable providing critical feedback. So you want to make sure you have a structure where they really can give candid, honest answers. Okay, so that was what we planned to cover, and we welcome any questions.
This is Henry from the Stevens Initiative. Jen and Christina, thanks so much for your presentation. We'd like to invite the folks attending the webinar today to type their questions in the questions box. Should be on the right side of your screen. You're very welcome to type any questions you have for Jen and Christina. We'll take a couple minutes to collect a few of them, or maybe just a moment, and then I will pose those questions to Jen and Christina. So please type your questions in the questions box, or if you're having any technical issues, type in the chat box and we'll try to address them. We'll just take a moment to collect a few. thanks so much for the questions that are coming in already. I'll start with the first from Rajwanti. Jen and Christina, the question is, has RTI identified the 6 or 7 global competencies to focus on already? And if so, what are some of the sources used to identify those competencies, or were they already identified by the initiative?
Sure, yeah, so we are far along, I would say, and coming to agreement with Aspen and the funders, and with a lot of input from the first wave of awardees. And we did that in a number of ways. We did that early on when we became the evaluators. We first looked at applicants, the successful applicants' applications and the types of outcomes that they said that they intended to improve, and we cataloged them, and that's where we could definitely see some themes around, at that point it was cross-cultural understanding, and then at 21st century skills, which we're now considering them together as global competencies. So we cataloged that based on what the practitioners were saying, and we brought that information to the evaluation working group of the first awardees, and together agreed on a set of common survey items that we asked everybody to use in the first wave. There were about 5 or so that awardees were already planning to do their own surveys, so we asked them to incorporate these, and they were things like some a sense of connection with the group with which they were having the virtual exchange, and also some self-report of problem-solving skills and cross-cultural communication. So we thought those, I think, were a good first start for the initiative, and as Christina mentioned, we are really looking to support increased rigor in terms of measurement, and then also in terms of evaluation design. So in terms of measurement, we did another review of the research, asked a lot of stakeholders, including all the awardees, for instruments that they were aware of, and we cataloged them. So these are existing instruments, like some folks might be aware that there's a draft PISA assessment of global skills that will be used internationally for 15-year-olds. So we cataloged those, and then have done sort of an iterative process of presenting them to the evaluation working group and Aspen, and together working to kind of narrow down what we think the key global competencies are. And we're at about 6 or 7, where we want to take it back again, one more round of taking it back to the Stevens Initiative and the evaluation working group before we post them, but I would say we're getting close.
Thanks very much, Jen. We have one from Rachel. Can you speak further on control or comparison groups? What are some best practices for the number and location? And do you have any resources that you can recommend for creating them? And I'd like to point out that we're going to do what we can to collect some additional resources that we'll share with all of you through a blog post. So Jen and Christina, if you mention any now, that's a help. But I know we'll work with you after this call to make sure we collect anything that you might not think about at this moment.
Sure. So unfortunately, there's not an easy answer on like how many you need. There's there's something called estimating the power of your analysis, and ideally you know some information like the expected level of change you're going to see on an outcome and how much variability there is going into the outcome. So oftentimes researchers, they'll have some information from previous studies that allow them to do some analyses and really get to a target number for comparisons that they can feel really comfortable about. So we don't have that yet in virtual exchanges. So I apologize for not having a great answer for that. But for example, I know our David Silver, who's not able to be here today, I think that question came to him, and when he heard about, there's potentially, I forget how many, maybe 900 participants, and so how many comparisons might we need? And I think his response, he was able to do the back of the envelope, and he said like 150 or something like that. So it doesn't need to be necessarily equal numbers of comparisons and controls. The most one way to do it is through random assignment. So you have an interested number of participants and you randomly assign folks to participate or not. That can be practically very hard to do. Some programs are just not comfortable with that, especially if they have the capacity to serve everybody who's interested. They don't want to turn folks away in order to have an RCT. But others, there might be, you might be in a position where there is an excess of demand and you can't accept anybody, so you can do some random assignment. Other ways are through a group that is similar to yours, participants, but not. So the example of perhaps if you're implementing a virtual exchange in your 9th grade science classes, perhaps for a year or two you do it in 2 sections and not the other 2 sections, and you try to keep the courses similar except for this virtual exchange component, and then your other classes sort of naturally serve as a comparison group.
One added consideration with that is to think about whether there could be spillover effects with your comparison group. So if your comparison group is in a different school from your participants and they have no interaction with each other, that's one thing. But if they're friends with the students who are participating, you have to consider the possibility that the participants might be sharing some of what they're learning with their friends, and that might affect the comparison group as well.
That's an important point. You also want to think about if you have a program that's with high school students in Jordan and high school students in the U.S., you really need a comparison for both of those groups. So just having a comparison in the U.S., that'll allow you to compare the outcomes of the U.S. students, but to be able to also talk about outcomes for the Jordanian students, you need a comparison group for them.
Thanks very much. There are still a lot of questions coming in, and we really appreciate it. And like I said, we'll try to do some follow-up after this webinar to make sure that we have covered everything that we can. The next question is from Rafaela. Question is, on behavior change, do you have any examples for how to address behavior change? And it's obviously quite a challenge to measure this even in everyday life.
Yes, definitely. So my first response is being really specific about what behavior change you think you're going to impact. So let's say it is continued interest and engagement with your partner's culture after the virtual exchange. That's one hope you have. So some behavior of that could be, are they communicating with either their actual partners or with others from that culture via social media more than they were before? Do they follow more Moroccan folks on Twitter, for example? That can be an example of a behavior change associated with an interest in more cultural experiences. Or do they seek out more virtual exchange or in-person exchanges? That could be a behavior change.
And also another one I think a lot of programs are really interested in is just in civic engagement. Mm-hmm. So did participation in the program, spur you to volunteer in your community or get involved with a civic organization? I think sometimes those changes are hard to measure right at the end of the program. If you're just, conducting a post-survey at the program ends, you might not see it as much as maybe you might if you conducted a follow-up survey after a couple months.
Thanks very much. The next question comes from Jody. She asks if you can share some tips to address self-reporting bias in surveys.
Yeah, that's a very important question. You certainly want to look at the item and choose items that hopefully are not clearly leading, so not obvious what the pro-social answer is. That can be hard. Another way that survey methodologists do this, and this can be tricky, especially we've found with younger folks and probably folks if they're doing it in a language that it's not their native or if it's being translated, but you alternate positive and negative statements. So you say things like, I want to keep communicating with folks from Jordan with, I never want to go to another country ever again. So you mix the positive and negative statements so that folks are less likely to sort of just go down the list and answer always strongly agree without really having to think about it. And I should mention that our colleague Jenny Spratt is on the phone, and Jenny, if you ever want to add anything, please do take yourself off mute and add your expertise.
Move on to the next question, and welcome Jenny's comments along the way. This is from Lori, also Lori, and I'll read it as it's written, and maybe you can make a sense of it. Some of the terms are beyond me. It says, in regard to validity and reliability, different cultural and linguistic locations or backgrounds will create different contexts that make post-positivistic forms of validity and reliability elusive. Have you taken this into account?
That's a good question. One thing we've tried to do, and we haven't done enough of, and we'd like to do that more, and we're especially excited that we can see some of the new awards have researchers from the MENA region, so to be able to have that expertise, being more sensitive and knowledgeable about the cultural context of the participants in the MENA region, and being able to share that. We have asked in the past our awardees to leverage their contacts, and many of them have experience, living in or cultural heritage experience from the countries that they're partnered with. So we've asked for that lens, but I think being able to partner with researchers in the non-U.S. partner country is one way to try to limit the bias of that.
Thanks. Shannon asks if you could say a little bit more about how a discourse analysis might be conducted for virtual exchange.
Sure, and actually at some point, I think within our evaluation advisory group, I think we'll invite the 2 or 3 groups that were doing it to come and share their findings and their methods. So one group was looking at the postings of these were high school classrooms, I think, posting on the platform together, and they were doing a sort of content analysis of the postings and coding for different aspects, like does it look like they're sharing more sophisticated cultural information with each other. So it's coding of textual data. And there are, as I mentioned, this is not an area of expertise of mine at all, but there are some programs that will look for example, more collaborative terms like we as opposed to I, and you can actually end up with some quantitative information about that. I know the one group, of course, with any data collection and analysis, you want to keep checking yourself about whether your plans still make sense. So one thing they had planned to do is one of their measures of like strengthened or deeper collaboration was, did the postings get longer? So in early of a program, were they just a few lines or a couple sentences, basis by the end of the program, were they longer? And they found that, but when they looked deeper, they realized at the end of the program, they were sharing it, or at one point in the program, they were sharing information about historical sites in their communities. And they had long postings, but it turns out they were cutting and pasting text from the internet about historical postings. So they realized, oh, that our intended metric of length of posting is not a valid measure for whether the exchange was deepening.
Thanks very much. We've had several questions where folks have sort of asked more about what they might get as resources from us as the initiative and from RTI. And I'm wondering, Jen and Christina, you earlier said on this conversation that that you're working on refining and sharing some more of what you think will be good measures that might be useful to address global competencies. What do you think might be shareable once we've reached a degree of comfort about what we're using and what we're suggesting our awardees to use? Can you imagine what we might be sharing beyond the awardee community?
Yeah, I could imagine being, a posting of this is our a not 50-page evaluation plan, but sort of a 5-page. This is how the Stevens Initiative is approaching evaluation. These specifically are the instruments we've developed, which we're going to develop survey, or they're really a collection of items from different survey instruments. So I would absolutely, as long as the Stevens Initiative was comfortable, we'd be comfortable with that. And maybe at some point also this larger catalog where we found we're cataloging items that haven't quite worked for Stevens Initiative, but it might be helpful for others, and also may just be reassuring for folks to see why there are other measures that might have been appropriate for other initiatives, but they weren't for the Stevens Initiative. But you can see that at least we considered them.
Thanks very much. Can you all give an example, and I think this will be maybe our last question of the day, can you give an example of a real or theoretical evaluation that reached the sort of strongest or highest level of rigor that you described earlier in your slideshow, as closely related to virtual exchange as possible, if not in the field of virtual exchange?
Yeah, okay. That's a very, I can mention a lot of others, but have we come across even in the in-person exchanges where there's random assignment or a matched comparison?
Not that's coming to mind,
yeah.
Although I would guess that it probably has been done.
Yeah, okay. So outside of that, I'll mention one we're engaged in right now, which is for adults who are facing multiple barriers to employment. So they might be homeless, have drug addiction problems, not be a high school graduate. And there are programs called social enterprises where they work in an organization that has a service or a product that's commercially available, and they offer sort of job readiness experiences for these folks who are face multiple barriers to employment. So what we're doing there is we are randomly assigning folks who are eligible for these programs because they're homeless or don't have a high school degree, and they're randomly being assigned into entering the social enterprise or not. So I apologize, that's not directly linked to virtual exchange, but.
Hey folks, this is Mohammed again. I just wanted to thank our friends from RTI for doing such a wonderful and insightful webinar for us today. Just as a reminder, this will be posted online on our YouTube channel for the Stevens Initiative. And for those of you on the line or listening, make sure to follow us on social media, and we really appreciate you participating with us today. And this concludes today's webinar. Thank you so much. Have a great day.